Welcome to In Studio. I'm Jay Daniels. Have you ever wanted to take a behind-the-scenes look at the operations of a radio station? Behind all of that good music that you hear, there are many special people who each do their part in creating that special sound. Our guest this week is Kayonne Riley. She's the director of one of the top full-time jazz stations in the country, WUCF 89.9 Jazz and More in Orlando, Florida. I really had a lot of fun doing this interview. You'll hear Kayonne's story of how she actually began as a classical DJ in Texas before moving to Orlando. She'll also provide some insight on the programming selections for WUCF. Kayonne, your radio career began at the home of Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. And the station where you had your first job in jazz was KAMU 90.9. And you weren't only a jazz host, but you also did classical, is that right?
Well, right. Well, I was hired as the traffic manager, which is, an entry-level position for radio and still is. It means you're doing the daily program logs and you're usually responsible for pre-recording shows for air and that sort of thing. And at KAMU and most small stations, you also have to be a program host. So my first week there, they said, well, you're doing a classical music show every morning from 10 to noon, and then you're going to do a jazz show on Monday afternoons, and we also need you to do a New Age show on Saturday night. So it was a little bit of everything at that station, which was great. And that's where I got my real introduction to being a jazz host and loving it, because we had a gentleman there who did a part-time show for us, and he's still there. His name is Rusty Rush, and he taught me so much about classic jazz and particularly classic singers in jazz, because that was his specialty. So that really turned me on to a love of jazz music. Classical music I had kind of grown up with. My mother was a music teacher, and I had been listening to classical music in my house all of my life. She had some jazz records too, but I think she leaned more in the classical music direction. So that area I was really comfortable with, but I really started learning jazz at that young age in my first job when I was, 22 years of age. And it has really carried on in my later life, because now being at WUCF, where we're a full-time jazz station, I think back to those early days and was glad that I had such a great mentor and got started in a field that would turn out to be my full-time job for many years.
And how many years did you stay there at KAMU?
I was at KAMU for about 6 years. And an interesting thing that I might have still been there to this very day, but I had something happen to me that really kind of changed my life. I was riding a motorcycle, and a guy pulled out in front of me, and I got into a really bad wreck, and it damaged my foot pretty badly. And I was laid up for 6 months. And, while I was still working part-time, I was basically laid up, healing this injury for 6 months. And it made me reassess where I was at. And I had been in College Station for about 10 years at that point, 4 years going to school, and then 6 more years working at the public radio, public TV station that was licensed to the school. So I had been in College Station for 10 years, and I was laying there for 6 months with this injury. I thought, boy, I need to get up and do something else and see other things in the world. And so I made the decision when I got up that I was going to start looking around for different things to do. And so I got attracted to the Orlando, Central Florida area because of the Full Sail program, which is sort of a trade school, but they also offer associate degrees and bachelor degrees. And I really wanted to get involved in the music industry, more directly in the music industry than in radio. So I thought I wanted to go into maybe doing live sound or studio recording or things like that, because I'd been doing that on the side in addition to my radio job. So that's what brought me to Central Florida. I left that job at KAMU. I didn't think I would ever go back into radio again. And I came out to Orlando and went to Full Sail for a year, met a lot of people that I'm still involved with, musicians and people in the recording industry, and did a lot of really cool things in that year. But at the end of that year, one of my friends saw a job posting for the University of Central Florida, and it was for a program director here at WUCF. And they said, Kayonne, you should apply to that. And I'm like, okay, well, what do I have to lose? And I applied for the job and got it and was immediately back in public radio at WUCF.
I can relate quite a bit to that, because I went to school working on a bachelor's in music education, choral music education, and halfway through my degree program, somehow radio had crept back in. I thought I was out of it, and lo and behold, it crept back in, and now I'm doing more radio than I was before. And it's always funny how life's journey works out for you there. And, you know, that, let me see, 1994, that was 25 years ago, right?
Yes, 94. So yeah, it was 25 years in March.
And so let's look at what you were greeted by at WUCF. When you first arrived at the station, it was not a full-time jazz formatted station as it is now, correct?
Right. We were kind of a mixed format, which was similar to what my previous station had been. And really in the old days of public radio, many stations had this mixed format. You had a little bit of news, you would have a little bit of classical music, some stations would have jazz, and it was kind of like, especially if you were the only station in town, you kind of had to give your listeners a little bit of all the great public radio formats. And that philosophy has definitely changed since that time, because now stations are either, for the most part, all news talk, or they're going to be all music. There's still a few mixed format stations, but that's not the norm anymore. And WUCF was like that when I got here. So what I was hired was to be the program director and to improve their ratings and their listenership donations. And so what I saw was we needed to standardize the format because you never knew what you were going to hear when you tuned in. It was different between, mornings with BBC News, and then we'd have a little classical music, and then we had some student alternative rock, and then the jazz was in the night times, and it was just all over the place. So we started slowly standardizing the format, and what we had found when we first started looking at the numbers and the donations was all of the listenership and all of the donations, the majority of it at least, came from the jazz listeners. And our large listenership numbers, back then it was called Arbitron, when we looked at those numbers, we had listenership when we played jazz. Everywhere else, it was fairly low numbers. So we started just peeling away the different formats and replacing it with jazz little by little. And it took a few years to do that. It took about 4 years. By 1998, we were almost all full-time jazz. We retained the NPR news breaks, but we have never aired Morning Edition or All Things Considered because there's another big public radio station here in Orlando, and they are all news talk all day long. So we've never wanted to duplicate programming. But we do want to serve the community with news, so we keep the NPR news breaks. We have them in the morning and at noon and in the afternoon. But other than that, it's all music. We have some NPR, the 1 hour jazz focused programs like Jazz Night in America with Christian McBride. There's not as many of those as there used to be because NPR has scaled back. And so when programs went away, like Marian McPartland's Piano Jazz did recently, we have replaced it with our own specialty 1 hour focused, jazz focused programs like our Live from Studio A series. And our Jazz Most Wanted. It's a top 10 countdown. And we have a program called Magazine. where we do interviews with jazz artists and record reviews and that sort of thing. But other than that, it's locally hosted jazz all day long, and it's doing very well for us.
Our in-studio guest is Kayonne Riley. She's the director of WUCF 89.9 Jazz and More in Orlando, Florida. And we're talking about a lot of her work and how they have developed the station over time, basically going from a block format, so to speak, with a mixture of news, talk, and jazz, to now in 2019, one of the most respected jazz radio stations in the country. And your focus is clearly on the listener. That has always been your focus as far as how can we best serve them. Let's talk about the Orlando jazz listening community. As you and I discussed before this call, every market is different. It has its own sort of uniqueness to it. It is not Minneapolis, just as Minneapolis is not New York City. Tell us, if you can, who are those jazz listeners in Orlando?
Well, as everybody knows, Florida is a state that we get a lot of people we call snowbirds, and we get a lot of retirees down here. So we do have a lot of older listeners that have come from other states, and being of that age demographic, many of them naturally are fans of jazz, and they grew up with this music, or they grew up with their parents playing this music. So we have a built-in audience of jazz lovers that come to Florida either seasonally or they've moved here and retired here. But on top of that, we've got a wonderful group, large group of professional musicians here. People that came to the area either to work and play music at Disney, or they located here just because of the great climate, and we've got a wonderful international airport. And if you're still a working musician, there's lots of work here, but it's easy to fly out to your other gigs if you have to. So we have a bunch of great pro musicians here that really love this music as well. They're supporters, they're listeners, they come in and play our live concerts. So that is unique. That's not something that I experienced at my previous station in College Station, Texas. That was a much smaller town. While there were some fine musicians there wasn't nearly the number and the pro level that we have here in Central Florida. And then besides that, I think the other thing that's really great is we're based at UCF, which has a fantastic music program, and we have a world-class jazz studies program that's led by saxophonist Jeff Rupert. And he recruits great young jazz students from all over the country to come here. He has recruited a top-notch jazz faculty. He brings in great pro world-class jazz musicians for workshops and things like that, concerts. So we've got a steady influx of fantastic jazz pros here, as well as aspiring young musicians. So that really makes it for a very rich climate for jazz. There's a lot of great jazz festivals here locally and across Florida. I think because of our retiree situation, jazz societies are very strong in every community here in Central Florida. So, from St. Pete, Sarasota, down in South Florida, here in Central Florida, there's the Space Coast Jazz Society, Jacksonville. There's just a high interest for jazz in Florida in general.
And considering that diverse audience that you spoke of, when you are programming your music rotation, and as a definition for those listening, music rotation is essentially the songs that you would hear on a day-to-day basis, excluding syndicated programs and specialty shows. When it comes down to the core music that you're programming, how do you serve such a diverse audience with so many musical selections? How do you narrow that down for them to where it's a palatable mix of music?
Oh boy. Well, in general, the music we play is typically jazz standards. So whether it's a brand new recording or a recording from the 1940s, it's probably going to be in the book of jazz standards and the songs that musicians and professionals recognize as the repertoire. Okay, so A Foggy Day, Autumn Leaves, all of those great songs that initially started out, some of the very early ones started out as Broadway show tunes, and then they were adopted by the jazz singers and the big bands, and that has continued through today. So typically we're playing a jazz standard. My other programming rule is it needs to be melodic. It needs to be an excellent recording. It needs to be well played. And beyond that, we do a nice mixture of 3 categories. And the 3 categories are current releases. So it's anything that's been released in the last 6 months or so. And we have about between 80 to 100 different song titles that are in the current category at any given time. After that, the second category is called recurrence. And a recurrent is anything that was a current, but it no longer is. And it spans back for us to about maybe the early 90s or so. And then before that, and the third category is gold. What we call gold is anything that's classic jazz. And that classic jazz category can go all the way up to the recurrent category. So you'll have the more modern recordings by Pat Metheny, and some of those things might be in the gold category. But they all of the 3 of those categories still have to be melodic. They have to be generally a recognizable standard. And well played and well recorded. So we mix those. And that's a standard way of programming for commercial radio. That's the categories that you would see at a rock station or a country music station or anything. And you rotate those categories so that a listener gets a wonderful mix of what's current, but it also is well played, and it's usually a recognizable standard, so it sits quite nicely next to maybe an Ella Fitzgerald cut, which would be gold, or maybe a Pat Metheny that was mid-90s that sits in there. So it all has to have a nice flow together. We do that by further categorizing the individual tunes. We code them for tempo, fast, medium, or slow. We also code them as to what is the format. Is it a big band? Is it a small group? Is it a Latin style? And then we also code it based on what's the main voice. Is the main voice a female singer, or is the main voice a saxophone? Or in the instance of a big band, there's really not a main voice. So we would leave that blank. And so we use our program director. We have a software program that we work in, and it spits out a basic log based on the rules that we've set up. But it also does a wonderful flow. So you won't get 5 saxophone pieces in a row. You will get a nice mixture. And it does that because we put a lot of work into coding the individual songs. So that's, we've kind of adopted basically commercial radio programming ideas and philosophy to programming public radio, jazz station.
And I don't think that's a bad thing at all, because your sound is definitely one that is listenable. There are many stations, and this is not just jazz, but you will listen for a song or two, and then by the third song, the first thing that you want to do is change the station, because it clearly is something that does not fit.
Yeah, that's why I say the software program spits it out, but the program director goes through it line by line and massages it and makes it into a listenable format. So that's how it works. The other thing that's different about us as a jazz station using a music software program is we have 20,000 titles that our database is using. Most commercial stations that you hear, rock, country, whatever, their database that they're programming from is 200, 300, maybe 400 titles. So when you have a rotation with only that many titles, you're going to get a lot of repetition. And that's intentional. They intentionally repeat it because the programming philosophy pre-internet was that play songs people want to hear and play them over and over and over. And there's something to be said for a little bit of that, but with jazz having such a rich and wide history, we've got decades of music that is fantastic. So we don't have to repeat songs that much. You might not hear, especially even with our currents, with 100 song titles, chances that you're going to hear that same song in a given week are pretty slim. It's going to rotate. Those 100 titles are each going to get about, some of them more, 10, 12 spins for one title in a week would be a lot. Generally, they're getting about 5 spins, but that's between 6 a.m. and 24 hours. So it's going to rotate. It's not going to play, if you hear it at 6 a.m. one day, it's going to play maybe at 7 p.m. at night 2 days later. So the chances of you hearing that repetition is a lot less. So there's a big difference between a commercial station doing this sort of music programming and the way that we do it.
Our guest on in studio is Kayonne Riley from WUCF FM 89.9 Jazz and More in Orlando, Florida. And you speak of a song library of about 20,000 tracks. And each week, and I have seen this stack at your desk, each week you receive literally dozens of new CDs for consideration, and not everyone makes it to the air. And as you discussed, there are certain factors that you have with regard to your music rotation. But when you are reviewing new albums, whether it's by a known artist who is well-renowned with a popular name in the industry, or perhaps it's a brand new artist on the scene, what are you listening for when you listen to these new recordings? What makes you say when you listen to a recording, this is something that I think would go well with, our format? Mm-hmm.
Oh, I say, first of all, I'm listening for excellence. Just if it's a singer, she or he's got to have excellent tone, on pitch. It helps to have a nice, unique quality to their voice. I don't want a Sinatra clone. I like to hear singers. An example would be Surreal Amy. I think she's got a really recognizable, neat style about her. I'm looking for well-played tunes. If they're going to do Autumn Leaves again, how are they spinning it in a different way? Is it got a little bit of a unique twist to it? Am I going to want to add that? Or maybe they're including a standard in their album that I don't have 100 copies of. Maybe it's something a little more obscure by Wayne Shorter or something. I'm always looking for new standards that haven't been overdone. I'm looking for, occasionally we'll play a brand new original. Maybe it's something that they wrote themselves, or they're trying to turn a pop tune into a new standard. Yeah. And Dave Stryker is doing that with, I think, his album 8-Track, where he takes these great pop hits from the 70s and he turns them into a really cool, funky jazz tunes like Papa Was a Rolling Stone and some of these older Marvin Gaye tunes. And so I'm looking for that, because with the audience of people that are, let's say, my age, people that are in their 40s or 50s, we grew up with music in the 70s and the 80s even. So for us, a jazz standard that we recognize from our era is very appealing. So I'm looking for those kinds of things too. and it's really for the younger demographic. It's not for my parents, because my parents love all the, the Frank Sinatra, the standards from that earlier era. And people that are my age are going to recognize that somebody came out with a Steely Dan tune. I can't think who it is now, but they redid a Steely Dan tune, and it is so cool, and it's instantly recognizable to those of us who were in college and we were listening to that music. But it's jazz, so I'm looking for that kind of stuff to expand our audience. And again, it's just, if it's played nicely, if it perks your ears up, it's melodic, and that's the kind of stuff I'm looking for.
And as we look at the direction of jazz music, where it's been and where it's headed, you're at the forefront a lot of these new sounds that are coming out, because you listen to them every week as they come across your desk, whether they are recordings from the songbook of Rodgers and Hart or Irving Berlin, or whether they are those newer Steely Dan Temptations recordings. Where do you see jazz headed from your perspective in radio?
It seems to be kind of similar to what I've seen even when I started back in the 1980s. There was always artists that were sticking to the real traditional mainstream sound, but they were putting their modern techniques on it, better recording technology, and so they came out with these recordings that sounded better than the earlier recordings, but they still stuck to that really kind of standard sound. Straight ahead is what we call it. But then there were always artists that were stretching the boundaries a little bit. And they were, in the 80s, it was fusion, in the late 70s and the 80s, it was fusion. They were stretching off in this other direction. That's still happening today. I still get a lot of artists that are sticking into that straight ahead jazz mainstream sound, but doing it with great modern technology and their own technical prowess. But there's also those artists that are crashing through some boundaries and experimenting, like Theo Croker, Kamasi Washington, and some of these people. So I see it because I've been watching this since the 80s. It's similar to what I saw back then. And I think that is probably going to continue. Even the artists that are making strides and going beyond just straight ahead jazz, most of those people are trained in the basics of jazz, and they have all of those straight ahead playing backgrounds, but they're making a conscious choice to, be a composer, make some new musical directions in their career. So I think that's going to continue. And I think because the straight ahead sound is so much fun to play, and it's still such a good way to be a musician, you're still going to see quite a few people continuing with that. So I hope it just continues this way. I love to see the exploration, but I also love to see artists staying grounded in tradition. And it seems like I'm still seeing a lot of that.
And as jazz continues to move and grow, so to speak, WUCF is also doing the same. You have a strong host of talent there at the station with your many announcers, a number of which have been very familiar to Orlando area listeners for some time. Thinking of Mark Taylor, Bob Kelly, and Robin Austin as three of those who I've listened to for several years, even though I don't live in the area. But as you think of your team and you think of your programming that you have, as you look ahead toward what's to come, how are you going to continue to grow in building your connection not only with the jazz community as a whole, but also with your listeners there in Orlando?
Well, what we've seen in Orlando in the last couple of years has been a large influx of residents from Puerto Rico, and we have been one of the main areas, metropolitan areas, that has absorbed a lot of these folks that had to flee the island because of the hurricane. And what we are wanting to do is address that community more with our programming. And the one way that we're already doing that we can do more of is with some great Latin jazz.
Yes.
So we're going to expand our Latin jazz offerings, and we hope to find some Latin jazz talent who can help us present that music. So that's one way that we're thinking of expanding. It's a direct response to how our community has changed, the demographics of our community. So that's one plan that we've got up our sleeve.
One final question for you, just as a lover of this music, and you not only present it on the radio, but you also perform as well. Mm-hmm. My question is this, just two simple words. Why music?
It is the best way for me to spend my days and nights. It is never ending interest. It never ceases to amaze me, the beauty and the ability and just the directions that people go with music. It is something I never get bored with. So to be able to do this is a blessing, and maybe I could do other things, but this really, really makes me happy. So that's why.
Kayonne Riley from WUCF 89.9 Jazz and More in Orlando, Florida, our in-studio guest for Simply Timeless. Be sure and visit the website WUCF.org. We're proud to consider them as a part of our Simply Timeless radio family. Until next time, I'm Jay Daniels, thanking you for joining us in studio.